Hi, everybody. Welcome back. As I said in the intro, today we're going to look at classical utilitarianism. We're going to look at the philosophers, the utilitarian philosophers, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. I'm going to present to you just a bare bones, very simple presentation of what I like to think of as the mechanics of utilitarianism. It's the basic, most fundamental principles that you need to understand in order to understand um, the heart of utilitarianism. We're not giving a complete, um, exposition of this. We're only going to enter into a few of the criticisms. Everything we say here, we could easily spend hours and hours and hours and days and weeks upon. So I'm interested in giving you kind of a skeletal view of this. So that being said, let's focus our attention on Jeremy Bentham. Now, Jeremy Bentham is a really interesting character, very concerned with society around him, our place in society. Um, he is the person who gave us the panopticon, which is a type of prison that the guard towers in the middle, and then all the jail cells are around that guard tower. And the idea was that the prisoners um, wouldn't be able to really tell when they were being observed by the guards. The idea was that that would alleviate some of the stress. We all know that having people constantly look at you and their attention on you can be very stressful. And he was actually concerned about the mental health of the prisoners, and he developed this prison. Now, it didn't end up working. It ended up being more stressful for the prisoners. Come to find out, when you know people are watching you, but you don't know when, it ends up being more stressful. But can't blame him for trying. Point is that he was very concerned about well-being of those around us. He was concerned about notions of pleasure and pain and happiness. We'll get to that in a second. He's one of the first people to advocate for what we might now think of as animal rights, although there were limitations to it. And he was arguing at one point that women ought to have rights, voting rights, and be able to own and hold property. He was summarily laughed at for all of these things. It's a really interesting person. You should look him up. But again, my point in telling you this is that he's very concerned with the well-being of society and our place in it. And he noticed a few things about what he thought was fundamental to um, to not just our behavior, but in considering our behavior, to morality. And that's kind of what this is about. So I'm assuming you've done the readings. If you haven't, you should. And if you're not in any of my classes and you're just watching this video, we're reading uh, Jeremy Bentham's the Principles of Moral Legislation and um, John Stuart Mill's second chapter on utilitarianism. Okay, so let's go over to our drawing board here. Um, for Bentham, then we're going to start off with his principle, and we're going to adopt the name, and we'll call it. Um, we'll use his name for it. The principle of utility. John Stuart Mill is going to go on to call it the greatest happiness principle. So, if you'll pardon my handwriting, the new toy I'm just sort of getting used to, and I'm going to try to incorporate into my lectures and so on. Now, what this principle states is that one should act to maximize the amount of happiness for the most amount of people and minimize the amount of unhappiness for the most amount of people, to maximize the amount of pleasure for the most amount of people, to minimize the amount of pain for the most amount of people. So that's the principle. A principle is kind of like a rule. Um, it's maybe a little stronger than a rule, but not quite as strong as a law. Somewhere in between. Um, you know, something maybe like a guideline, but stronger, like something like a rule, right? Um, it's a principle to follow. Presumably, without a principle like this, then you wouldn't be following anything, perhaps maybe your emotions or something like that, something unreliable like that. So we have our principle now. And he states this in the beginning. Um, Act in such a way that you promote the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people. And we're going to understand happiness here in a little bit, and we're going to be able to define it in terms of pleasure and pain. Now, from that language, we get a couple of things from that the language of that definition. So when we talk about the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people, so act in such a way. Sorry, this is a little sort of a new toy here, and the cursor keeps resetting. That's interesting. I'm not used to that. Anyway, what we're referring to here, in a sense, is a consequentialist idea. Oh, that is getting irritating. This is a form of consequentialism. This is a consequentialist idea. And what this means is that when we're thinking of consequentialist ideas, we're assuming that the consequences of some action are what matter. So when we're evaluating some action for its rightness or wrongness, then we're going to be considering the consequences of those actions and what they produce, something good, something bad, something pleasurable, something painful, and so on. We're also considering uh, some other notions here. We're considering notions of um, minimization and maximization. We are minimizing something, trying to minimize something, and trying to maximize something. In other words, we're talking about quantity. We're talking about some type of measure of something. And this is going to be important a little bit later on. So we're concerned with the consequences of actions, and we're concerned with the minimization and maximization of certain aspects of those consequences. And as the principle tells us, what we're after is trying to quantify, we're trying to maximize the quantity of pleasure and minimize the quantity of pain. So then, the question arises is how do we define happiness? Now, this is a little difficult in one sense and familiar in another sense, right? So it's familiar in that we're all probably used to talking about happiness. We're all probably used to somehow talking about the language of, I want to be happy. Um, and what we would ask, what I would ask, and what classes like this are about is to get you to ask yourself, like, what do you mean by that? Or when other people use the word, what do you think they mean by it? Right? It's incumbent upon us as rational, intellectual, sentient beings who care presumably about our life and the type of life that we live to ask about the important things. And happiness seems to be one of those things that is very important to us. So, what do we mean by it? In particular, what do the utilitarians mean by this? With special attention to uh, uh, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Um, and as it turns out, it means something sort of very specific. So, um, we need to think in terms of fundamentals here. What is at the base ground level of our moral decision making, right? And this is a tendency that you see in sort of intellectual history, whether it's science or philosophy or even religion. People want to get at a foundation. They want to get out some sort of grounding level that ground supports everything else, just like a building, right? You need a solid foundation in order to build a house or a large skyscraper or something. If that foundation is in any way bad or flawed, then it doesn't matter how good the materials are that you put on it, it's going to come down. And so intellectually, we kind of want something similar, or at least that's the hope, right? And so Jeremy Bentham is looking for that type of foundation. And we can understand this in a particular sort of way. So when he says that we find ourselves under two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. A sovereign is a governor, it's a ruler, it's a king, it's a queen, something like that. A sovereign is somebody who has the authority to govern and make decisions about how things operate. A king is sort of a typical example. A king is sovereign, right? So what he means here when he says that pleasure and pain are our two sovereign masters, he means that everything we do is somehow motivated by pleasure and pain, whether you know it or not, whether you realize it or not. The reason why you do the things you do is some motivation of pleasure and pain. So let's go back to our drawing board here and let's give ourselves some space here. And let's start at the bottom here. And we'll have on the one side pleasure. On the other side, we'll have pain. And we'll be abbreviating pain like that, and we'll be abbreviating pleasure like that. That's PL. Now, consider any action whatsoever, any action, from the mundane to the sublime, and ask yourself, why do you behave that way? Why do you act in a way such that you do this or that you do that? What's motivating you? And remember, think fundamentals. And this might not be something that you are necessarily familiar with, but think fundamentally. Why do you do the things you do? What motivates you? Why do you marry the person that you marry? Why do you want to have the job that you want to have? Why do you pick the classes that you pick? Why do you go to that restaurant that you want to go to, and so on and so on? Any action whatsoever. Why you buy the certain type of toilet paper you buy, right? To who you marry, to the type of toilet paper you buy, and ask yourself, what's actually motivating you? Bentham thinks it's pleasure and pain. You marry the person that you marry, presumably because you think that not doing it is somehow going to make things worse, emotionally, possibly financially, and so on. That there's a certain measure of pain that is associated with, say, not marrying or not marrying the person you want. Same goes for toilet paper, right? Why buy that certain brand of toilet paper over another brand? Presumably, according to Bentham, there's some measure of pleasure or pain that's associated with it. It could be physical comfort or discomfort. It could be maybe psychological. Maybe certain toilet paper costs way more than another, and you're willing to sacrifice this or that because so maybe you're willing to sacrifice some of the physical pleasure of a better quality toilet paper to avoid the psychological pain of, say, really expensive toilet paper that you're just going to be throwing away anyway. So you can see sort of from the outset, it can get really, really complicated. I'll try to minimize that. We're only after sort of the basic understanding here. And so Bentham thinks that it's pleasure and pain. Um, I was looking at the wrong camera. Sorry about that. Pleasure and pain, that's important here. Um, this is basic. This is fundamental as far as Bentham is concerned. Um, we can't think of anything more fundamental than this basic principle of pleasure and pain. Now, let's just sort of continue here and let's explore this idea. So, if pleasure and pain are basic, and for Bentham they certainly are, what do we say about things that please us and things that cause us pain? Do we or do we not tend to say that things that please us tend to make us happy? Sorry, I'm fiddling with my tool here. Happy, right? And things that bring us pain tend to make us the opposite of happy. Now, at this point, students will typically say sadness. Sadness is not the opposite of happiness. The opposite of happiness is unhappiness. So, happy and unhappiness, or I should say, unhappy. Again, ask yourself, are things that please us not things that we say make us happy? It could be children, it could be money, it could be ice cream, right? Why do you like ice cream? Why does ice cream make you happy? Because it's pleasing. Why does having to cut your vacation short make you unhappy? Because there's a certain type of pain that's associated with it, right? We continue. Do we or do we not say things like things that make us happy are good? Things that make us unhappy are bad, right? I think you'll agree that if you have a good job, we're sort of being ambiguous here about the moral nature of the word goodness here, but I think you'll see what we're getting at. A good job is a job that makes you happy. Ultimately, it's a job that's pleasing. Why? Because maybe you can feel fulfilled by helping others in that job, or maybe you feel fulfilled. Maybe being able to utilize your skills is pleasing, and we say the opposite for a bad job, a job that doesn't let you utilize your skills, or actually causes pain to maybe even to other people or something. Then finally, we say that things that are good are right. Meaning morally right. Things that are bad are wrong. Um, Immoral. So this is kind of the basic notion of right and wrong, good and bad. This is the basic notion um, of how we define what's right or wrong, good or bad in terms of pleasure and pain for Jeremy Bentham. Again, he's thinking here in terms of um, fundamentals, in terms of a base. And for him, pleasure and pain, as he says, and you should have read, are our sovereign masters. We don't escape being creatures of pleasure and pain. Now, just one other thing to notice here. You'll notice here that these are states of affairs about the world. You're in a state of pleasure, or you're in a state of happiness. By the time we get to here, these are judgments. These in particular are, I should say, moral judgments. So this is sort of crucial to Bentham's approach here. He's looking for something fundamental. He's looking to our basic nature of things. And our basic nature is that we are pleasure seekers and we want to avoid pain. Now we're going to understand pleasure here. It's not sort of the bastardization of hedonism where, people just seek out pleasure, and it's usually in sort of a licentious type of way. That's not what we mean here. Um, I might touch on that later, but we're talking about the basic notion of what is pleasing and what is painful. Okay, so this is crucial here that you notice that he is trying to pick up on um, how the world is, in a sense, if you will, and going from how the world is to being able to make a judgment about that world. In other words, going from basic states of pleasure and pain here to being able to make judgments about what's good or bad, right or wrong. Okay, now consider, if you will, keep that in mind, keep this notion of pleasure and pain and happiness in mind. Now consider the following scenario. Let's consider two people. First is Big Brutus. Now, Big Brutus is a big guy, mean guy. He doesn't shower very often. He's not too smart, and he basically hates people. And so when he goes to Walmart, right, he goes, and if there's a child that's annoying him, crying or yelling or whatever, he'll just go over and smack it. And he's not really scared of anybody else because he's bigger than everybody else. He's an excellent fighter, right? So he's not really scared of anybody, right? But he'll just go and smack the child just to shut him up, right? On his way back from Walmart, if he sees a puppy, he'll kick it and just, just kick it, like total disregard for anything other than himself, to the point where he causes extreme misery for other people. Now, what are our gut reactions about Big Brutus here? Is Big Brutus, and this is how he operates. Like, it's not just sort of a one-time thing, like only when he goes to Walmart, right? This is what Big Brutus does. This is his personality. This is him. If you see Big Brutus, this is how he is going to act. What do you say about him? Is he a good person or a bad person? Again, he's not just in a bad mood this one day. This is his normal behavior. And he does other things too. These are just two examples. This is how he operates. Is he a good person or is he a bad person? What does your sort of gut tell you, right? What's your inclination about this? When you ask people, they'll typically say, well, on a scale of sort of morality, good or bad, there doesn't seem to be an in-between for Big Brutus. Big Brutus seems to be bad. If he goes around like smacking children, I almost said children that he doesn't know. Like, it probably doesn't matter, right? It might even be worse if he knew them. If he goes around and he's willing to just smack kids because he doesn't like how they're acting, and kicking, harmless puppies, if that's his nature, most people will tend to say that that Brutus is bad. Big Brutus is bad. Now consider Big Brutus's twin brother, Great Eugene. And Eugene, rather than kick puppies and smack around children, he funds from his own pocket. He funds children's welfare programs and schools, and he rescues kittens. Right, that's what he does, and he does other things too. But this is his basic personality. He's the type of person that brings a huge amount of benefit to the people that are around him. You can always count on him. He's always going to do sort of the right thing. No one is ever harmed by his actions. It's the opposite. People are generally made better because of his involvement in something. What do we tend to say about people like Big Brutus? We're going to tend to say that people like Big Brutus are good. Right? I mean, just ask yourself. It's not a one-time thing. This is who he is, this is how, or I should say they, this is how they act. Big Brutus bad, Great Eugene good. Why? Because they make people happy or they make people unhappy. How? By increasing the amount of pleasure that people experience or by increasing the amount of pain that people experience. And this is where you ask yourself, why do you do the things that you do? What motivates you? And what your authors are asking you here are what really, really, really motivates you. And I think your authors think that at least to some degree you are motivated by pleasure and pain. Do you or do you not try to avoid things that make you uncomfortable, that bring you discomfort? I think if you're being honest with yourself, then you're going to answer that question in a very particular sort of way. Okay. So then, let's go back to our drawing board here, and let's look at how this might pan out to a certain degree. Let's think in terms of a scale here. So we'll draw 3 scales, and on the one side, let's have the scale tipped, and on one side is pleasure, and on the other side is pain. And here we'll have a scale, and on the one side, pleasure, on the other side, pain. And then let's have the scale tipped this way, and on the one side, pleasure, and on the other side, pain. Now let's again keep in mind our definition of our principle of utility. One should act in such a way that promotes the most amount of happiness, where we understand happiness is pleasure, for the most amount of people. We'll get to the most amount of people part in a second, but one should promote the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people. One should act in such a way where one does not promote the most amount of pain for the most amount of people. If we look at our representations here, right, we see on the one side, in a situation where pleasure is promoted and pain is minimized, the utilitarian would say that this is a morally good action. Morally good. Here, in a situation where the action equally promotes pleasure and pain, and so the scale isn't tipped, and I'm losing connectivity with my device here, and I hope I get that connectivity back. If you'll bear with me a moment. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. Where it's equal, sorry, that was, then we say this is morally neutral. And so the action could be performed or not be performed. So if you perform the action, fine. If you don't, fine. Here, where an action promotes more pain than pleasure, then the action is morally bad and therefore not permitted. It's just sort of a quick way of being able to imagine what this looks like. So we're looking for the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people. Now, let's take the principle again. One should act in such a way that one promotes the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people. And I mentioned earlier, this is a notion of quantity. This is a notion of calculation as well. We seemingly need to decide something, whether an action, that something is whether an action is good or bad, according to how it affects a certain amount of people. So, in order to do this, we're going to need to be able to calculate um, something, right? So, let's go back here. We're going to need to be able to calculate. So, calculating morality. What do we mean by that? We're going to call this the hedonic calculus. Calculating um, pleasure. I'll get to that word hedonic here in a moment. The most amount of people is an interesting sort of thing to consider. When we talk about the most amount of people, for sheer just quantity's sake, we can talk about 50, let's say 50 plus 1%. So, if there's 100 people involved in a certain action, then we're looking for 51 out of those 50 people to count as the most amount, literally the strict majority. If it's 1,000 people, then we're looking for 501 people. So whatever 50% plus one, whatever that is, then that's what we are looking for. We're going to keep it simple. We'll work in terms of, like 10, 100 people, something easily conceivable. So how are we going to go about calculating morality? Well, following Bentham, there's a few things that we need to consider first. So first thing is we need to, in our scale that we're thinking of, we're thinking in terms of scales. We need to think about certain characteristics of morality, or certain characteristics of an action, right? So if we're trying to decide whether any action is good or bad, there are aspects of those actions that are going to be concerning to us, and he labels them. One is intensity. And we can think of strong to weak. So for any given action, there's going to be a certain amount of intensity that can be associated with that action. Food is a really nice way of trying to get this example across. We're all familiar with food. We all have sort of favorite foods and non-favorite foods we don't like. And you might think of something like, let's say, a nicely cooked and seasoned steak, for example. That can be an incredibly intense flavor. Or let's say, maybe some drink like our fruit drinks. Some people like fruit drinks that are really strong. Some people like fruit drinks that are sort of not so strong. So, or if we're talking about, maybe a case like murder, for example. Even an action like murder can be associated with a certain level of intensity or not. You just might imagine, someone murdering for the first time, and that being a really intense experience. And after 20 times, that experience might get weaker and weaker, and so on. So you can think about intensity with just about any action. We are to think of duration. And here we're looking at longer versus shorter times. And literally, there's a certain amount of pleasure or pain that's associated with how long an action takes. Some actions can become, um, are pleasurable based on how long they last or how short they last. But this is going to be an element of uh, our moral thinking as well. Next, we have certainty. And we're going to think in terms of certainty and uncertainty. In other words, part of how we decide and how Bentham wants us to think about our moral decision making is how certain are we that a certain action is going to bring pleasure or pain, or how uncertain. The certainty or uncertainty itself can cause a measure of pleasure or pain. So I don't know, let's say you want to go see the new movie that's coming out, right? How certain are you that that movie is going to be pleasurable? How uncertain are you? And these are things that we need to sort of think about. Like uncertainty can bring a certain amount of mental discomfort. Certainty can bring a certain amount of mental comfort, and so on. So, how certain are we that a certain action is going to bring pleasure or pain? Next, we have a fancy word, propinquity, or another word would be remoteness. Literally, how near or how far is that pleasure? Some things that are really pleasurable might be really far away. And the closeness to that could itself bring a certain measure of pleasure or pain. If that new movie you want to see is only being shown in one movie theater in Houston and it's 20 miles away across town, um, that could impede your ability to experience pleasure. And that impediment could actually cause you to experience a certain amount of discomfort, and vice versa. Maybe your favorite taco stand is literally down the street, in which case that pleasure is really close. And it's not just that those tacos are pleasurable, but knowing that it's so close itself adds to that pleasure. Five, we have fecundity. Um, so we think of fruitfulness. Um, so literally, how is that pleasure or pain likely to produce other pleasures or other pains? Or is it likely to not produce other pleasures or other pains? So when we talk about fecundity, we're talking about um, that pleasure and its ability to produce further pleasure, essentially. And then finally, we talk about purity. Um, and what we're talking about here is, are those pleasures or pains mixed with any other pleasures or pains? A pure pleasure would be pleasure unmixed by any pain. A pure pain would be pain unmixed by any amount of pleasure. So, for something to be purely pleasurable means that there must not be any pain associated with it. And for something to be purely painful, there must not be any pleasure associated with it. Just offhand, I remember one time I had a double ear infection, and uh, I never quite experienced a pain like this before. The pain was remarkable. There was absolutely no pleasure associated with it. It was nothing but pain, and I can't express it to you, but it was this weird experience for me that I remember um, before I was able to take some pain pills. I remember thinking, like, being surprised at how painful this was. It was just pure pain. It's kind of the only experience I have of this, and I imagine experiences of pure pleasure and pure pain are probably very rare in life. Um, I'm sure we'll experience once or twice as we live, but the idea would be to presumably get as close to a pure experience of pleasure as possible. Okay, so here is a then basic idea. Again, all of this is very, very basic. This is the bare bones mechanisms of what your authors are writing and what they're asking you to think about. Um, of how to think about pleasure and pain, of what you need to keep in mind as you're thinking about pleasure and pain, and part of this calculus, of this calculation of pleasure and pain. Now that we have some idea of this sort of scale, this measurement, this like we're going to be measuring pleasure or pain, and we're going to be trying to find out for the most people whether an action is pleasurable or not, in order to make a moral judgment about whether it's right or wrong, good or bad. We have to calculate. Now, we know we're dealing with quantity because of the word most in most amount of people. We know that we're trying to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So the quantities we're after are a certain quantity of pleasure and a certain quantity of pain, namely the most, whatever the most happens to be. But we know something about measurement, right? In order to measure something, we need a basic unit of something. And as funny as it might sound, what we're asking for here are basic units of pleasure, or the basic unit of pleasure and the basic unit of pain. And so we're going to go ahead and give this a a name. Let's go to our second page here. And what we're going to do is we are going to call whoops, sorry. We're going to call, we're going to use the word hedon. And a hedon is one unit of pleasure. And we're going to say a dolor is one unit of pain. And we'll just refer to that as H and D respectively. So we're going to call a hedon, when you hear the word hedon, you're going to understand a unit of pleasure. When you hear the word dolor, we're going to understand the word pain. I'm not making these words up. This is part of the literature. This is part of how utilitarians to this day talk about pleasure and pain. In fact, you can look up. There are certain even government reports that actually use the word hedon and hedonic to refer to the presence or absence of pleasure and pain. Believe it or not. So I'm not making this up. The word hedon comes from a Greek word meaning pleasure. The word dolor comes from the Latin word of the same dolor. It still exists in Spanish. That means pain. So these are real words again, not making this stuff up. But we're just going to make it a convention to say that a hedon is one unit of pleasure and a dolor is one unit of pain. So then, if there are, say, 10 people involved and an action produces an overall amount of 100 hedons and let's say 30 dolors for that group of 10 people, then the action would be good, right? So that's the basic idea here. Okay, so we have our basic units of measurement. Then going back, what we would do is, again, I'm not going to write this all out, but you'll get the idea here, is in order to calculate this, we would literally draw a table, and on the one hand, we'd have pleasure, and on the other hand, we'd have pain. And then we would list out those 6 criteria of intensity, duration, and let's say certainty. That says certainty. Apologize, but you're listening to this, so okay. And we need another scale here, and let's just do our hedons. Let's have a scale from 0 to 10. 0 meaning no pleasure or pain, depending on, and 10 meaning a maximum of pleasure or pain. Right? And so let's just take any action. Let's just call it, action X, whatever the action is. Should I buy pizza for the class, for example? Whatever the action is, murder, robbing a bank, donating to charity, whatever the action is, for any individual, that individual would figure out, in terms of intensity, how many hedons from 0 to 10 am I going to associate? Let's just say donate to charity, right? In terms of intensity, how intense is donating to charity, and how much pleasure do I get from it? And let's say I'm going to give donating to charity 8 hedons associated with intensity. And let's just say, but, I do have to go out of my way, and I do have to, give up some of my stuff. And so I'm going to associate $3 worth of pain. It doesn't have to equal 10 here, right? So I guess the maximum, how we're setting it up here, would be, you could have a maximum of 20, but that's in a sense kind of arbitrary. So there is some pain associated with donating to charity, right? You have to, go drive to the place. You have to get the stuff together. You have to possibly get some of your own stuff away. But then I get a huge psychological boon. I feel really good about myself when I donate to charity. So it's, in a sense, the pleasure outweighs the pain here. How long does it last? Well, the act of donating to charity, it kind of depends, right? Any single act could last a couple of minutes. It could last hours. Maybe you're volunteering. It just kind of depends on the action. Let's assume I'm volunteering. So let's say that the act of volunteering, I'm volunteering for 4 hours at a children's book drive. It's Houston, it's summer, and so honestly, in terms of the length of time that I'm doing it, it's hot outside, it's humid, right? I'm hungry. I'm probably only gonna give about 2 hedons to this. I'm probably gonna give closer to something like 5 units of pain to it, because maybe I'm outside or something, right? And depending on where you're at, this might shift. This is one of the neat things about this. It becomes very individualized to that person. How certain am I that similar acts are going to produce more pleasure? I'm actually pretty certain, right? This is one of the more certain things. So I'm going to give this a 9, and I'm going to give this maybe a 1. Again, it doesn't have to equal to 10 here. That's just kind of my own personal assessment of how this works out. So we have our other characteristics here, and then what we do is we total it up. And let's say I end up with something close to, say, about 35 units of pleasure of hedons, right? And let's say I end up with, let's say, 20 units of pain for that particular action. Then what we do, right? The next thing we do, I'm just going to mark that off here, is we need to figure out how many How many people are involved in the action? How many people are going to be affected by that action? In other words, how many people do we need to include in the calculation? And let's just assume there's 50 people. It could be 100, could be 1,000, could be a million, it could be two. It's just going to depend on the circumstance and the situation. Then what we would have is we would have 50 people doing this same table, right? We would have 50 people doing that same table. So we would have 50 of these tables with each individually assigning the values to those criteria for that specific action. Then what we would finally do is we would draw another final big table, shorter, with hedons on one side, dolores on the other, and we would add up everything from those 50 tables. And let's say we ended up with something close to about 3,006 hedons and 1,293 dolores. Then what we see is this is akin to that one visual that we saw where this action is expected to produce more pleasure than it is pain. And as we saw before, this is approved as a morally good act. So, in other words, regarding our example, and this goes for any example that you have, but our example of donating to charity, the reason you should donate to charity, or I should say the reason donating to charity is good, is a morally good sanctioned act, is because on the whole, it produces more pleasure than it does pain for the people involved. And we didn't do it here, but it includes the people who it benefits. So this would be under fecundity, for example. Is this action expected to produce further pleasure? And presumably for the people that you donate to, it would. And you do this with any action, Bentham says, whatsoever. Any action, period. Now, if you read carefully, now he admits that you can't do this obviously for every action. It's impractical. What he's asking and what I'm asking is that you get a feel for this, about how this works, because then you can start applying it, right? Just sort of naturally. In fact, I would go so far as to say is that you actually kind of do this already. You just didn't realize you did it. So, for example, let's say on any given weekend, let's say this weekend, it was a holiday weekend. Yeah. We have some decisions to make. Are you going to go out? Are you going to go hang out with your friends? Are you going to go hang out with your family? Are you going to stay home? Do you want to watch a movie? Do you want to go to a party? So on and so forth. We have these decisions to make. How do you make those decisions? Right? You're going to say to yourself things like, well, I really want to go to this party. My friend is going to go, but man, it's kind of far away. And if I go, I'm going to end up spending some money, and so on. However, if I do go, I know I'm going to have a really good time, right? So you're going to weigh some of these things, how far something is, how much money you're going to spend, how certain are you that you're going to have fun when you're there, and so on. You're going to make these calculations. We all have friends that some are more fun than others. Some are more safe than others. Maybe your safe friends who you trust with your life or your banking information, maybe they're a little boring, right? So you're not going to have as much fun with them. On the other hand, the pleasure that they end up producing for you is of a different type, and so on. Yeah. Whereas the other friends who you really have a good time with, they're maybe a little more dangerous, and you can't hang out with them too often because, as we all know, too much danger can produce a bunch of pain, and that's not necessarily desirable either, particularly when you're asking about the maximization of pleasure and the minimization of pain. You kind of do this anyway. What Bentham is doing for us here is showing us sort of mechanically what that looks like and how you might approach this. And so once you have an idea of this type of calculation, you realize that you don't need to do this for every action. You have, as Bentham says, you have a mind for it. You just kind of realize how this is done, and then you can begin to make those decisions sort of on the spot a little bit. You get used to it. Okay. Now, let's get into a little bit of um, some criticism here, and let's ask about where maybe Bentham is going wrong, just sort of historically, and what other people historically have said about this. Okay, one major criticism in what we just covered in Bentham's basic idea of utilitarianism is that in order to do this, you have to take a very egalitarian attitude toward pleasure and pain. And this is expressed in the idea that there is a basic unit of pleasure and pain. One hedon for me has the exact same value as one hedon for you. One dolor, one unit of pain for me, has the same intrinsic value as one unit of pain for you. So let's say we both stub our toe on the door, and let's say I rate that 5 units of hedons, and let's say you rated 8 units, of dolors, and you rated 8 units of dolors. What we're saying is that your 8 means that your experience of pain is greater than my experience of pain. And that can only be true if the basic fundamental unit are identical. Otherwise, if we had different ideas about what pleasure or pain is, then there would be no way to tell whether your 8 is more painful than my 5. The only way it works, right, is if the basic units are the same. It's kind of the same in cooking, right? If you have a recipe and you see a recipe that calls for, 3 cups of flour, and you have this other recipe that calls for 3 cups of flour, if the basic unit cup means something different in both those cases, then there's no way to compare the two. You have to have the same basic unit mean the same thing across the board. Now, why is this a problem? Well, if everybody's pleasures and pains are the same, or mathematically the same, if all you are after is quantity, the amount of pleasure and pain, then you would have to include any being who experienced pleasure and pain. A cat, a dog, a horse, a pig. In fact, if you read John Stuart Mill, this is one of the criticisms. This is referred to historically as a swine morality, a morality fit for swine, fit for pigs, right? Because pigs feel pleasure and pain. Now, they can't articulate it in the way that we can, but in terms of the experience of it, if you take a sharp stick and you stab at the pig, it's going to squeal in pain. The same thing is going to happen if you do that to a human being. They may not squeal, but they're going to display pain avoidance behavior. Pain in this sense is equal across the board. There is no qualitative difference between pains, only a matter of quantity. For Bentham, and he's serious about this, a game of bowling, or an early form, what was called pushpin, a game of bowling is not qualitatively different than a sunset. All you're concerned with is quantity of pleasure and pain. All you can do is assign a certain amount of hedons or dolors to any action, and any one unit is identical to any other unit. And this was sort of disturbing because it put the specialness of humans on par with animals. And although biologically, yes, humans are animals in the taxa, right, kingdom Animalia, humans historically have thought themselves to be higher and better than animals. And so to have a moral theory that says, well, we're sort of on the same level as a pig, this was deeply, deeply disturbing to Bentham's contemporaries. A criticism that follows on the heels of this is that Bentham's philosophy, moral philosophy, conspicuously leaves out human rationality, right? Other than say maybe this calculation, so you need to be able to sort of basically like calculate things. But even dogs and pigs know how to avoid pleasure and pain. Not only just know how to avoid it, they tend to maximize what's pleasurable and minimize what's painful. Even right, and so Bentham's moral philosophy here does not explicitly talk about any intrinsic value that human rationality has. And so this ended up being a source of contention for Bentham and his contemporaries. So if we can go back here really quick, hopefully my pen is still working here. I lost connectivity. I should gain it here in a moment. I'll just fiddle around with this till. So you can imagine then how upsetting this might be and how upsetting it might be sort of to you right now. Yeah. Okay. Now let's emphasize this here. So Bentham, we associate with quantity. John Stuart Mill, sorry about that. I'm not sure why it's doing that. And let's just try to. John Stuart Mill, we associate with quality. And so, what John Stuart Mill does for us is he is a utilitarian. He renames the principle of utility from Bentham and calls it the greatest happiness principle. So he espouses the same basic idea. The big contribution that Mill adds is to include quality as part of the calculation. So you're still supposed to have in mind this idea of the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people, the most amount of pleasure for the most amount of people. But what matters now is that pleasures and pains aren't simply egalitarian anymore. Pleasures and pains can be distinguished in terms of quality. And so, for example, whereas it might be really pleasurable to, let's say go out to a nice restaurant, maybe by myself, and to have a great meal, there's a certain qualitative aspect to that that's different from, say, reading poetry, right? Or watching a beautiful sunset. There are qualitative differences. And so in our calculations, we would add extra hedons or extra dolors because of the quality of something. And so he has this sort of very famous thought experiment here. And the idea is that if a human was promised the fullest pleasure of a beast, and by beast he means a pig or a dog or a horse or something like that, you would turn that down if it meant not being rational, because being rational opens up certain types, certain qualitative types of pleasure. if you've ever seen a dog chase a squirrel in the park or something, or sunbathe, right? You know, the dog's like lying in the sun and they love their belly scratched and chasing squirrels. If you've ever seen a happy dog, it's a great thing to see. And they get that stupid little smile on their face, right? It's it's a joy to watch, and they're certainly happy. Mill's point is that it takes more to make a human being happy than the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasure. Sure, that stuff's great, right? Having a full belly, a warm place to sleep, chasing squirrels, and belly rubs, that's all great. But that's fantastic for a dog. That would be a poor life for a human being. It takes more, he says, to make us happy than it does for a dog or a pig. It's the qualitative aspect. Consider if I had the ability with the snap of my finger to say, okay, just say yes or no, right? I'll promise you a life where you never get sick, you have the best food, a nice place to sleep, and so on. But you're going to be dumb. You're going to lose all your intellectual, higher level faculties to the point where you're not going to be able to add one and one is equal to two. And when you see a sunset, where I or somebody else might think, oh, how beautiful that is, and be able to write poetry about it and so on, all you're going to see is it's time to go to bed. You're going to lose all those higher level um, abilities. Mill's point is that no rational human being is going to give that up because of the qualitative nature of the pleasures that being a rational being brings us. Imagine friendship, for example. Undoubtedly, dogs and cats have favorite people that they associate with, right? But that is different from the pleasure that you feel as a friend or being a friend. There's a qualitative difference. The cat might enjoy being on your lap and being loved on, and they nuzzle you and rub on you and so on, and certainly the cat is sort of maximally pleased, but that's not good enough for a human being, right? A human being needs a friend. And you might be friendly to your cat, or your cat might be your friend, but it's not a friend in the deep, meaningful sense that humans can have friendship relationships. And this is what Mill's contribution is to utilitarianism. He adds quality where Bentham is only focused on quantity. Now, Mill is also focused on quantity. So it's still the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people, where happiness is defined in terms of pleasure, unhappiness, pain. But where Bentham is only concerned with quantity, Mill is concerned with quality. There's a qualitative aspect to the calculation now. Okay, one final point, and then we can call it quits. Sort of a major criticism when it comes to this utilitarian idea. And it's sort of interesting, and it involves sort of an ideal situation. So I'll do it by way of a thought experiment, much like kind of I did a little bit previously. Let's say I promised you through some godlike power that I had that at the snap of my finger, I can make the following happen. Like previously, you'll know no sickness, you'll know no pain, you'll have good food, warm place to sleep, blah, blah, blah. And you get to keep your rationality. You get to have all those qualitative experiences. You can be as smart or as dumb as you choose to be, right? At the snap of my finger. And you can enjoy all of the allowances that your physical and mental capacities give you, right? Just think about what I'm promising. And let's say I'll promise this for the entire greater Houston area. That's what, 6.8 million people or something. You'll recognize that that's a huge amount of happiness that I'm promising. Yeah, the snap of my finger. I'll even make it such that once you make that decision and I snap my finger and make it happen, you're gonna forget. You'll forget you even made the decision. I'll throw that in for free, right? So you know that you're going to make the decision, and once you make the decision, if you make that decision, then you're going to forget about it. Why is that important? Because there's one catch. The catch to making this happen is that we have to take one person's little niece or nephew, let's say a little 7-year-old niece or nephew, take them down to the basement, chain them up to the radiator. They don't get to see any daylight. They get no affection. They're fed dog food the rest of their life. And that's how they end their days. And when they die, we take somebody else's and we do the same thing. So one person will suffer maximally for the sake of 6.8 million people, minus one, to experience the fullest of life. And everybody's going to forget what that situation is. The question is would you do it? Now, when you poll people, when you ask them in the classroom and outside, there's always somebody who says, yes, I'll do it. Like someone, there's usually just in a class of about 30 students, right? At least one person will immediately say, yeah, I'll do it without, right? It's very funny. Everybody laughs. Now, who knows what you would actually do, right? I don't know. You probably don't know what you would actually do with faced with that real situation. But it's probably telling that most people, the vast majority of people, recognize that that's pretty immoral, that that's no kind of happiness worth having. It's somehow not genuine because one person, one small little innocent person who doesn't deserve that amount of pain is experiencing it for our own sake. And so most people, what they say when you ask them is that they wouldn't do it because they immediately recognize the immoral nature of this. And yet, if we follow the principle of utility, are we doing something moral? And the answer is yes. And so we have a basic conflict of interest here. Our moral intuition in the 21st century is that that situation is wrong. And 6.8 million people shouldn't be happy at the cost, the deliberate cost of forcing one innocent, particularly child, to suffer. That's not worth it. And that's sort of an interesting dilemma, right? Our moral intuition says one thing, and yet utilitarianism says another thing. And this is sort of a classic criticism against utilitarianism. The interesting thing, I think, if you think about this, and if you pay attention to the news or you know, arguments in the state legislature, in healthcare and education, and various fields, is that there is this prevailing notion that somehow the most amount of goodness, the most amount of happiness counts for something. We want most citizens to be happy and so on. We want most citizens to be healthy and so on. And so these ideas, despite some of these criticisms, and we're giving you a very, very simple version of these criticisms. Everything we've presented so far is just scratching the surface. Just please understand that. But despite these criticisms over the years, these utilitarian ideas keep popping up. The greatest good for the greatest number, the greatest amount of happiness for the most amount of people, and so on and so forth. These ideas keep popping up over and over and over. And so that means that we need to think about this and sort of continue the critical reflection on what we mean by happiness, and how we arrive at our moral decisions, how we arrive at our moral conclusions. So if you recall the distinction between ethics and morality, morality are the claims and judgments and attitudes about what's good or bad, right or wrong. So if you say, murder is wrong, that is a moral judgment, right? That is a moral judgment. Let's go back to our little thing here. When you say murder is wrong, you are making a moral judgment. And what we understand is that judgment, according to utilitarianism, is based off the fact that it produces in the world a state of affairs where more pain is produced for more people. And that's why it's bad. Right? And this is why we're doing ethics. So the moral claim that say murder is wrong or donating to charity is good, those are moral claims. What we're doing here is asking what makes those judgments true? How do we arrive at those judgments? From an ethical standpoint, we arrive at those moral judgments by understanding, at least as the utilitarian considers it, that pain is associated with wrong and immoral acts because of the amount of pain that it produces for the amount of people involved. Murder brings probably no pleasure to anybody except maybe one or two people, period. And it outweighs the pleasure, that the pain outweighs the pleasure that's done. And so this is one way of understanding how we arrive, or how we could arrive at our moral decisions. So I'll leave you with this. When you talk about your moral judgments, what's right or wrong, good or bad, what are you basing that judgment on? What makes that thing right or wrong, good or bad, and that you're so confident in that judgment? The utilitarians give us a really interesting way of looking at that. Okay, hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon. Thank you.